There were rules you learned growing up in Britain that were never written down, never explained in detail, and yet somehow felt more important than almost anything else you were ever taught. No one handed you a list. No one sat you down and formally explained them. You simply absorbed them, quietly, through tone of voice, through looks across a room, and through the sudden silence that followed when you got one wrong. These weren't laws, they weren't school rules written on a board, and they weren't always enforced with shouting or punishment. But break one of them and you felt it immediately. Because in Britain, manners weren't just about politeness. They were about restraint, respect, and knowing exactly where you stood. Once you learned these manners, you were expected to follow them without question, and once you broke one, you rarely forgot it. Number 1. Speaking when adults were talking. One of the very first manners you learned was that adult conversations were not meant for you. If grown-ups were talking, you stayed quiet. You didn't interrupt. You didn't add your opinion. And you certainly didn't raise your voice to be heard. You could sit there for minutes, sometimes longer, holding a thought in your head, waiting for a pause that never came. And if you did try to speak at the wrong moment, all it took was a look, a sharp glance, a raised eyebrow, sometimes just your name said quietly but firmly. It wasn't considered harsh, it was considered proper. Adults talked, children listened, and you learned very early that being silent was often safer than being noticed. Number 2. Talking back. There was a very clear difference between asking a question and talking back, and every child knew that difference instinctively, even if they couldn't explain it. Talking back didn't require shouting. It didn't even require disagreement. A certain tone. A sigh. A look that lingered too long. Any of these could be enough. Once you were accused of talking back, the conversation was over. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't defend your point, because defending yourself was simply more talking back. You learned quickly that acceptance was valued more than explanation, and silence, once again, was the safest response. Number 3. Forgetting to say please and thank you. Saying please and thank you wasn't optional. It wasn't a polite extra. It was the absolute minimum expected of you. Forgetting to say either of them didn't just make you rude, it made you badly brought up. And that distinction mattered. If you forgot, you were corrected immediately. Sometimes by your parents, sometimes by the adult you were speaking to, and occasionally by a complete stranger who felt entirely justified in reminding you of your manners. You weren't just representing yourself. You were representing your family, and every missing please or thank you felt like a small, public failure. Number 4. Using the wrong tone. In Britain, it was rarely just about what you said. It was about how you said it. You could use the correct words and still get into trouble if your tone was off. Too sharp, too casual, too familiar. Even sounding tired or bored could be enough to trigger a correction. Parents were experts at hearing disrespect where you hadn't intended any, and once your tone was questioned, you knew you were already in danger. Learning to control your voice, your expression, and even your posture became second nature, because manners weren't just spoken, they were performed. Number 5. Not offering your seat. On buses, trains, and in waiting rooms, there was an unspoken expectation that you paid attention to the people around you. Elderly passengers, pregnant women, anyone who looked like they needed to sit more than you did. You didn't wait to be asked. You stood up, quietly, immediately. If you didn't, someone else would notice, maybe your parent, maybe another adult nearby. and being told to move was far worse than standing up on your own. It wasn't framed as kindness, it was framed as knowing your place and learning when to give way without being prompted. Number 6. Being too loud in public. Volume control was a manner all on its own. Children were expected to know when to lower their voices without being told. Shops, buses, waiting rooms, restaurants. These were all places where you were expected to exist quietly. If you laughed too loudly or spoke too much, you were corrected. Sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a look, often with the reminder that people are watching. Being noticed for the wrong reason was deeply uncomfortable, and manners were about avoiding that feeling at all costs. Number 7. Failing to greet adults properly. Greeting adults wasn't casual. You didn't just nod, you didn't mumble, you didn't hide behind someone else. You looked up, you acknowledged them, you spoke clearly, and if you forgot, you were reminded. Sometimes immediately. Sometimes later, once the visitor had gone. But it was always mentioned. Not greeting someone properly wasn't considered shyness. It was considered rudeness. And politeness was expected, even when it didn't come naturally. Number 8. Answering the door or the phone incorrectly. If the phone rang or the doorbell went, there was a correct way to respond, and children were expected to know it. You didn't joke. You didn't sound unsure. You didn't speak too quietly or too casually. You answered properly, often using phrases you'd been taught word for word. Answering badly wasn't just embarrassing, it was careless, because you weren't just answering for yourself. You were speaking on behalf of the household. Number 9. Table manners were not optional. The dinner table was where manners were tested most often. Elbows off the table, mouth closed while chewing. Cutlery used properly, no complaining. Meals weren't just about eating, they were lessons. You were expected to sit properly, behave properly, and eat what you were given without comment. And if you failed, the correction was immediate, often public, sometimes humiliating. Because learning table manners wasn't private. It was something you were expected to master in front of others. Number 10. Showing too much emotion. Strong emotions were something to be controlled, especially in public. Crying, sulking, overexcitement. Any of these could be met with quiet disapproval. Children learned very early that keeping yourself together was part of good manners. Feelings was something you managed privately, not something you displayed openly. Being told to calm down or compose yourself was less about comfort and more about control. Number 11. Correcting adults. Even when an adult was clearly wrong, correcting them was dangerous territory. Pointing out a mistake, questioning a statement, even offering clarification could be seen as disrespectful. You learned that hierarchy mattered more than accuracy, and that knowing something didn't always give you permission to say it. Number 12. Forgetting your manners in someone else's home. Different homes meant different rules, and you were expected to follow them instantly. You sat where you were told. You ate what you were given. You behaved better than you ever did at home. If you embarrassed your parents in someone else's house, you didn't forget it, because that mistake was often discussed later, quietly, firmly, and in detail. Number 13. Drawing attention to yourself. Perhaps the most important rule of all was this: don't draw attention to yourself. Standing out, making a scene, being noticed. None of these were encouraged. Good manners meant blending in, being unobtrusive, not causing discomfort for anyone else. And children learned very early that the less attention you attracted, the safer you felt. There were no manuals for these manners, no written rules, no official lessons. And yet, almost everyone who grew up in Britain remembers them clearly. They shaped how people spoke, how they sat, how they moved through the world. And once you learned them, you were expected to follow them without thinking. Not because anyone explained why, but because that was simply how things were. And even now, decades later, many people still hear those rules in the back of their minds, in their voice, in their posture, in the way they instinctively correct themselves without realizing why. How many of these did you grow up with? Let us know in the comments.